Stanford University.
Next week we're going to have Paulo Blickstein from the School of Education, and he's been doing some interesting work on fabrication toolkits for children. This week we welcome Mike Kuniavsky, who is a designer and founder of the design consultancy ThingM.
Yes.
It was also a co-founder of
Adaptive
Path.
Yes.
And did some education at University of Michigan, I just learned.
Yeah, I did my 2 simultaneous undergraduate degrees at the University of Michigan.
And also has a number of books. One of them, the most recent, is called Smart Things, about ubiquitous computing, user experience design. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been to these lectures before, and I've always found them great, so I'm very, very honored to have been invited to participate. So let me tell you a little bit about who I am. I will fill in a little bit from what Stephen said. I'm a user experience designer and entrepreneur. I was one of the first professional web designers in 1993. Since then, I've worked on the user experience design of hundreds of websites. And I also consult. I just scrolled through a bunch of stuff that I've worked on. I also consult on the design of digital consumer products, and I've helped a number of consumer electronics and appliance manufacturers kind of create better user experiences and more user-centered design cultures within their companies as a consultant. So I sat out the first .com crash writing a book based on the work that I had been doing. It's a cookbook of user research methods. There it is up there. It's used in a number of different places as a textbook. And hot on the heels of that, I co-founded a design and consulting company called Adaptive Path, which has been fairly influential. And I decided, after working on nonstop on the web for 10 years, I decided to leave the web behind in 2004. And I founded a company with Todd Kurt called ThingM in 2006. And we're a small ubiquitous computing company, and we design, manufacture, and sell Ubicom hardware. I will tell you a little bit more about what that is. This talk is based on a chapter, or really kind of a couple of chapters from my new book on ubiquitous computing user experience design. It's called Smart Things. It came out in September, and it's published by Morgan Kaufman. And what this book is, and let me kind of give you like a kind of an idea of kind of where I'm coming from on several different planes, is this book is my attempt to create a framework for the different kinds of activities and the products of those activities involved in the design and the creation of devices that use information processing but are not themselves general purpose computers. They're not things that we think of as general purpose computers. They're things that we think of as specific devices, but information processing is a very core component of what it is that they do. Because for me as a designer, I find it very useful to have interesting constraints. And so what this book was my way of trying to define some interesting constraints for the design of ubiquitous computing hardware. So the book actually has a lot of illustrations and techniques and in-depth case studies. It's actually, I tried to design the book so that it would be a very practical book for designers. But I also wanted to talk about kind of some larger concepts, some more theoretical things. And this talk is largely drawn from the theoretical side of that rather than the practical side. So that's your preface for what I'm about to talk about. So I want to start by talking about what I consider to be a curious phenomenon, which is that if any of you follow the development of microprocessors, you would notice the clock speed of today's new CPUs is basically the same as that of CPUs from 5 years ago. So for those of us who got used to computers in the 80s and 90s, this is actually quite confusing because we watch clock speeds go from 6 megahertz to 3 gigahertz in the span of about 20 years. And during that time, we became used to that as the measure of power and value in information processing. Clock speed was equated to value. But after 20 years of a logarithmic increase, you've seen all the Moore's law curves, and then this is just essentially that. But during the 20 years of a logarithmic increase that spanned 3 orders of magnitude, suddenly clock speed stopped growing abruptly in 2004. So the industry went from exponential growth to no growth to zero growth in one season. You can kind of see that. Like since then, the average clock speed it's bounced around 3.3 gigahertz, but it's around there. But it really just hasn't gone up. If that curve had continued, we'd have clock speeds in the 10 gigahertz at this point, but we don't. And so why did they slam on the brake? It's like someone just yanked the emergency brake while going full speed. So I call this phenomenon, as it says up there, peak megahertz. So unlike oil, we're not actually literally running out of CPU clock cycles. But what we are seeing is we're seeing a reevaluation of how we understand the value that computers and computation provides. And this has resulted in a shift in the strategy of microprocessor makers. So what happened in 2004, broadly speaking, probably actually happened in 2002, we only saw it in 2004, was that chip manufacturers saw that they were running out of uses, that we were running out of uses for big, energy-hungry, hot processors. And they shifted the game. They shifted what it is that they were doing. So since 2004, the competition has shifted from raw CPU power to making smaller, cooler chips that can do as much as older chips while using fewer resources. So take a look at this slide from Paul Otellini's, the CEO of Intel, from Paul Otellini's talk at the Intel Developer Forum last year. So notice that instead of talking about numbers going up, he's talking about, and he's really emphasizing, the processing manufacturers have been all about pushing numbers down. So then instead of competing on doing more with more, not Intel, but Intel and the other microprocessor makers are now competing on doing the same with less. Less power, smaller size, lower cost. What this has done is this has shifted a lot of of our expectations for how information is used and the cost of information processing. One of the main effects that it's had is that in addition to pushing the price, size, and energy consumption of kind of the latest, the fastest CPUs down, it also pushes the price of all previous processing technologies down with it. So, for example, at the beginning of the internet era, say in 1989, and I know the internet existed before then, but really this is the beginning of the web era. We had the 486 as the state of the art, and it cost about $1,500 in today's dollars. So, and it's actually the processor that the web was built for and with. In 1993, when everybody was working on early web browsers and early web servers, essentially the machine they had on their desk was a 46, or a variant of it. Today, you can buy that same amount of processing power for 50 cents, and it uses a fraction of the energy and a fraction of the size. So the decrease in price and size and power is roughly the same 3 orders of magnitude as the increase in speed that we saw during that same period. And this is not a coincidence, because both of them are products of the same underlying technological change. Now, what happens when technology gets this cheap? When technology falls in price this much, it opens up enormous possibilities for new products and new uses, while at the same time creating fundamental changes in society and our relationship to technology in the world around us. As these technologies displace established social systems and networks and uses. So steam engines, for example, lowered the price of harnessing energy by similarly multiple orders of magnitude. From horses and human power, you suddenly got coal power. And it's a Newcomen engine from 16 somewhere like late 17th century. The Industrial Revolution was born as people found all kinds of new uses because it was now super cheap. People found mechanical energy was now super cheap. People found all kinds of new uses for mechanical energy. And the Industrial Revolution was born as the application of mechanical energy became cheap and possible when you were thinking about how you're going to make something or what you were going to make it out of. It became an option to make things where it was never make things in ways that never existed and put power where it had never been before. Similarly, you can see similar transformative effects if you look at what happened with the price of extracting aluminum. It dropped 3 orders or 2 orders of magnitude in 1885. There's a very specific date when aluminum went from being a precious metal to being cheap. That's, it's in 1885. You can see that, and now, of course, we think of aluminum in entirely different ways. We don't think of it as a precious metal. Literally, before 1885, it was a precious metal. Similarly, electric motors became significantly cheaper and smaller in the 1920s, and we suddenly got the explosion of what we now call appliances, like kitchen appliances. Could not exist before electric motors were cheap. So when something becomes really cheap, it joins the toolkit of things that we create our world with. It becomes a design material. Not a raw material, but a design material, something we can think about as a material with which we can design new objects. Sometimes this is for better, sometimes this is for worse. I can tell you all kinds of things about why the Industrial Revolution created all kinds of problems and why aluminum smelting creates all kinds of issues. But no technology is neutral. It's always a double-edged sword. But it does fundamentally change things. So in the last 5 years, cheap small processing has drastically lowered the cost of taking information in, evaluating it, manipulating it, rearranging it, and acting on it. So it's no longer unthinkable to have an everyday object use an embedded processor to take a small piece of information, say the temperature or the pressure, the orientation of a device, or your meeting schedule, and autonomously act on it to help it do its job better. It is now a design material. Information processing is now effectively a material to design with. So let me give you a specific example of that. So this is a new system on a chip from Microchip. This chip has, I will show you the stats on it. It has about as much processing power as that initial 486. It has an onboard video controller that can drive a VGA screen. It has a USB controller for peripherals. It has a 24-channel analog to digital converter for sensors, and a capacitive sensing driver that can drive a touch screen. Costs about $5 and uses less power than a keyring flashlight. And fits on a chip the size of your fingernail. The actual chip is literally like, it's a centimeter square. It's also not unusual. Every single major microprocessor maker has an equivalent device. Essentially, those of you who have iPads, the iPad is based on the ARM A4, which is effectively one of these. So it costs a little more because it's a little faster, but it's effectively one of these. So products like this mean that information is quickly becoming a material that you can practically design with, pragmatically design with. And so enabling objects to make autonomous decisions and act using arbitrary information has now joined the palette of options that you have as a product designer when creating a compelling, effective new product, regardless of what that product is. And I believe that this is as deep an infrastructural change in our world and in the way that we make our world and the way we think about our world as electrification, as steam power, as mechanical printing. I think that this may be as big of a deal as when bricks became cheap to make. When people invented bricks and you no longer had to make a stone into a block, that lowered the cost of building significantly. Suddenly the world changed. Seriously, really, it's a huge change. And I'm in awe of it every day. But so if information is design material, the next question is, well, what are its material properties? Sure, at some level there are basic information theoretic properties, bandwidth, noise, complexity, but those are kind of the microscopic properties. That's like the equivalent of like basic nuclear forces, when you're talking about material science. That won't help me design a Tickle Me Elmo. Knowing kind of those things is not really like it's useful at some level, but not in a practical way. So what are the macroscopic properties of information that we can design with? So here's my personal, completely ad hoc, arbitrary, well, not arbitrary, but my own personal list. So first of all, it can sense the world. If you've ever looked at a book of sensors, like one of the catalogs that has 5,000 pages of sensors, there are thousands of sensors that convert states of the world into electricity that can then be manipulated as information. This set of things also includes sensors that can sense human intention. We call these sensors buttons or knobs. These are the ways the devices sense human intention. So next property is that it can autonomously act on the world. So actuators is the generic term for anything that can make a physical change based on input that can be triggered by information. So thus information can be used to autonomously affect the world in a way that no previous material has been capable of. Next, information can be used to store knowledge about a state of the world and then act on it later. So this can be just a single piece of data. A mechanical thermostat is essentially a kind of information-based device that stores exactly one piece of data, which is the temperature that you'd like to keep the house at. It can also be something much more sophisticated, like storing an image of everything you've looked at, which is exactly what Justin TV was doing a couple of years ago. Everything that he saw was stored. And so the gamut of what can be remembered is enormous. So the next property is that information can be used to repeat things exactly. So one of the most, to me, this is one of the most transformative qualities, is that it can be duplicated exactly and transmitted flawlessly. We know this. So this has of course changed the music and video world forever. I'm showing a picture of a bazaar of pirated content. But it also means that device behavior, can be replicated exactly. Now we've become kind of acclimated to this, but I want to pull away from this and kind of talk about the enormity of the idea of near exact replication in a world full of randomness. That's a pretty amazing thing, and it's enabled by information as a material. And it's a core part of what makes working with material so powerful. So the next thing is that we, again, are familiar with networking communication. So technology enables devices made with information to communicate autonomously. So the cactus on the left, right there, is a cell tower. And it enables mobile devices passing by it on the freeway to communicate to the world at large. If you've ever driven through the Southwest, you have experienced this, if not necessarily that same cactus. So what gets sent? So what you have is you have autonomous machine-to-machine communication in the form of telemetry, in the form of Google Map tiles, in the form of pictures of your friends on Facebook getting downloaded to you as you drive by, or of new firmware. So communication becomes this key thing, and machine-to-machine communication becomes this key quality of information as a material. So what a lot of this adds up to is that you can create complex behaviors that are orders of magnitude more complex than possible with traditional materials, traditional mechanics, at a fraction of the cost. So this is the cockpit of a modern a small airplane. You can see the small avionics system. So it kind of looks like it's a flight simulator embedded inside an actual plane. So, but the actual devices there are actually all pretty much generic PCs. They're pretty standard computers just running specialized software. If you compare that to a traditional gyroscopic autopilot, which is what this is, where every single component in that device had to be uniquely engineered, and it actually does very little compared to the generic devices on the screen behind. And if you want to change how this gyroscopic autopilot behaves, you have to re-engineer the whole thing from scratch. Whereas with the information-based devices, you just you upload new firmware, and there you have new behavior. Finally, what it does is it allows you to encode knowledge. So modern cars don't stall or need chokes because automotive engineers have installed sensors and actuators that are then connected to algorithms, and the algorithms embody those engineers' knowledge of engine thermodynamics to adjust the car performance dynamically in response to data. So the sensors and actuators work with this encoded knowledge that's encoded in the form of algorithms to keep your car from stalling. Modern cars, if you've ever had to drive a car with a choke, a modern car, and try not to stall that thing, you know what kind of a miracle modern cars are, that you just really can't stall them. Well, you can't. It is, because I'll now talk about the blender. So this is a BlendTech programmable kitchen blender. So with it, you can program a specific sequence of blender power, speed, and duration, and associate that sequence with a button on the blender. So you chuckle. But what this does is it allows you to embed someone's experience and knowledge about food processing into the tool, which then replicates that as a consistent behavior, rather than requiring the operator of the tool to have that knowledge and develop that experience. This blender and that behavior of the blender is the basis, well, one of the bases of Jamba Juice's business model. So Jamba Juice depends on such blenders so that their staff don't actually have to know how to blend this variety of ingredients. It's been pre-programmed into the blender. It's a small thing, but that's the cornerstone of their business. And embedding into the knowledge of the tool wouldn't have been possible without if the tool hadn't been made with information processing. And that's part of I don't know their business model, but I'm assuming that's where a huge part of their revenues is because they can do things consistently without having to train people very much. The behavior that the thing is enabled, the information property that information enables is the value of the device. So if you just said, hey, wait a minute, I kind of know all of this, I've grown up in the digital world, I've seen all this stuff, and besides, Norbert Wiener just talked all about this stuff in 1948, so you're really behind the curve. Well, no, you're right. None of what I'm saying is new. We're intuitively familiar with these properties because we've all been using computers for a long time. And you can come up with many examples of products that exploit these properties. But there's a big difference that happens between theory and practice, between pragmatics and the theoretical basis of it. Leonardo da Vinci was writing about mechanized flight, in the 15th century. But it wasn't until Douglas Aviation really, I think Douglas, and people who are aviation scholars will probably tell me I'm wrong, but Douglas created new manufacturing techniques and used materials such as aluminum that commercial flight and a fundamental change in society and the world became pragmatically possible. We're now at that point where that theory can become reality in terms of information processing. And we're now at a position where we can actually make it happen. So now I want to talk about, really I want to speculate about treating information as a material, about designing with information as a material, kind of what happens when you treat information as a material in terms of how it affects design. So what I want to start with is I want to say that first what it does is it changes the way that we think of hardware. Because information can encode knowledge and experience, that makes it actually possible to reduce the complexity of anything, including the complexity of using information technology itself. So embedded processors make it possible to create an abstraction layer around basic sensing, processing, and actuation to create building blocks that are meaningful in human terms, not just electronic terms. So each block becomes an atom of functionality. It has a CPU and it communicates with other blocks over a network. It has maybe some sensors, some actuators, whatever. But it becomes an atom of functionality. And what I believe is what we're now seeing is we're seeing the start of object-oriented hardware. I mean, that term has been used before, but I think we're really actually seeing the start of something that really is very object-oriented. What you see here are mostly prototypes that make it easier to demonstrate the idea. But one of the interesting things is that this is actually the way that a lot of modern devices are constructed. If you look at a modern digital device, it's already more like a small network of interacting heterogeneous components than a monolithic product of a single ground-up engineering process. So here's iSupply's teardown of the Nokia N8. So if any of you have ever looked, so iSupply is this company that supplies kind of competitive information about what devices are made of. Like they buy a thing off the shelf, and then they just rip it open, and they just count all the chips, and they see who made the chips. And they kind of rip the little plastic off the chips that are concealed. They try to figure out who made that chip. And then they kind of tell you, okay, the Nokia N8 is made out of these components. If you look, Nokia basically makes none of them. Nokia makes none of those components. They buy them off the shelf like Lego bricks, and they combine them to make a final product. From what this starts to mean from an interaction design standpoint, from a product design standpoint, is that the object-oriented hardware means that rather than starting from basic principles of electronics, you can now focus more on what experience you're trying to create rather than what capacitor you need to use. So, to really hammer the point home, designers don't smelt their own iron and they don't grow their own hardwoods. So why should you do that with electronics? And we're now getting to a point where that's actually starting to happen. It turns object-oriented hardware, this kind of abstraction layer around hardware, turns information from being a raw material into being a design material. So this is where I pitch my current company. So my company, Thingum, makes a set of such atoms of functionality, atoms of information processing for emitting light. So our Blinkum line of smart LED products makes it very easy to put controllable RGB light into arbitrary locations without any knowledge of electronics or color theory. I recommend all of you pick up some today at electronics retailers worldwide. Okay, end of sales pitch. So, but what I want to do is I want to move on to, okay, what happens, what do you actually start making with these atoms? Like, what are the molecules that are now starting to be made with these object-oriented atoms? In a sense, with information as a material in that sense. So on the next larger scale, we're going to see kind of personal scale tools. So we know we have digital pedometers, internet-connected bathroom scales, network parking meters, again, cars that don't stall. But there's actually going to be many more, because if you pick nearly any object and you add information to it as a material, you get a new object. It does something new and different. This plus a camera plus a CPU is the Anodo pen. That totally different object, totally the same object, but seen in a different way. Information processing fundamentally changes everything it touches. My favorite example of this is the Adidas One shoe, which was put out 5 years ago and then basically immediately discontinued. Possibly because it's a really ugly running shoe. But what's interesting about it to me is that it has a pressure sensor inside it and a processor and a small actuator. And what it does is it uses the pressure sensor to estimate the qualities of the surface that's being run on and adjusts the springiness of the heel in between strides. So it knows you've lifted your foot. It knows that the last time you put some amount of pressure down, it has an algorithm in it that that has some expertise built into it. So they understood that these kinds of measurements equate to this kind of performance, and this is what you actually need as a runner to create kind of an optimal envelope for you to be running in, and it adjusts the heel in response. The buttons on the side, you can see two little buttons on the instep. The buttons on the side adjust that performance envelope, and they can adjust it dynamically as you're running, so you can be pushing the buttons as you're running. What it's doing is it's fundamentally changed the nature of a shoe. A shoe is now this kind of adaptive system, and it's simultaneously sensing, processing, and acting on the world in between strides. For me, it really represents how a very small amount of information, carefully deployed, can profoundly change an object. Let me talk about what happened when Apple swapped out a couple of the properties there. So Nike and Apple took the same basic concept, and they swapped out the process of actuation, which was the heel, with communication. So what they did is they took essentially the same piece of information, and rather than having it change the nature of the heel, they essentially just had it communicate through an iPod or an iPhone to a network. What this then did is this fundamentally shifted the nature of the object again. So that tiny piece of information now enables your running shoe to become the key ingredient it becomes the entry point into a new way of experiencing the world as a runner. You start getting analytics about your performance. You start getting a social network comparing your running to everyone else. And you start to getting all of the other things that that you can do on the internet, but it is now done through the kind of narrow wedge of the shoe that you use. And that is a fundamentally different way of experiencing an object than we've ever had before. So at a still larger level, I think what we're going to see kind of moving like one notch slightly further out, or maybe to the side. Depends on how you look at this. We're going to see information used as a decorative material. Because just as you can use wood to hold up a house or to make a sculpture out of, those are both totally legitimate uses for wood. Sometimes both. Sometimes, if you see a Victorian house, it is both half sculpture, half structural. So information can be used to create, I believe, incredibly beautiful, profound aesthetic experiences. As we know, it has already revolutionized music and cinema, but treating information as a permanent decorative material rather than just a medium creates fantastic new opportunities. What those are, I don't know, but we're seeing them every day, and we see information being used not in a functional sense but in an aesthetic sense constantly, and that's, I think, a huge change. One of the things that's happening when you have that is that then that changes our relationship with electronics and changes our relationship with electronic objects. We start to see electronic objects more than just as disposable consumer electronics, but as something that become inherent parts of our lives, things that we decorate ourselves with, things that we find beautiful in and of themselves, not just in terms of functionality they give us this season. So Matt Cottam, who's an industrial designer, has actually started exploring this concept. He started exploring the concept of what are the qualities you need to have an heirloom electronics object, something that's going to be passed down for generations. What does it take to create a device made with information that has both operational longevity and the long-term utility of a traditional heirloom? And how can we integrate the functional and aesthetic properties such that our digital devices are not less interesting and less useful with time? So I don't have any answers to this, but these are the kinds of questions that I think we can now start to ask ourselves now that it's kind of cheap enough to do this. So next, I think that what next kind of, again, kind of scale up, is that our understanding of what a device is and what a device does and where its value lies is similarly changing when we get devices that are made with information. And we already have some experience with connected devices that are so tightly coupled to digital services out in the cloud or wherever, that they're useless without them. So an ATM is actually a pretty generic general purpose computer. You've probably seen them with the Windows blue screen on them, or Linux thing. It's a totally generic PC with a couple of extra things for counting and giving out money. What's interesting about it as a device, though, is that it's basically useless without the network that it's connected to. If you disconnect an ATM from the network, it's dead. Sure, you can reuse the computer, but as a complete function device, it's dead. Mobile phones without the mobile phone network, pretty much useless. They're devices that are so tightly coupled to the network that they're connected to that they become useless without it. And what this then leads to is that I think we're going to see many more of these kinds of devices. They're devices that are very, very tightly coupled to services, and I call them service avatars. So in the sense that they're a projection of the service into a material object. So that really what happens when you use an ATM is you're using the banking service through this avatar of the bank. You can also use that same banking service online or through your phone or by talking to a teller. They're all avatars of the same service. You think of them as being of the same service, even though they're physically very different devices. The value of the device dissolves in favor of the service itself. So if you start to think about something like digital images, so a service, say Flickr, that is essentially a digital image service, digital image aggregation service. If you get a camera, if you get a digital camera, you might start to think, I think some people relate to this, and this is one way of thinking about it, a digital camera becomes just a really, really good way of getting photos into Flickr. It's a way of getting really good photos into Flickr. The camera on your phone, it's a mediocre way of getting photos into Flickr. This camera, a digital SLR, it's a really good way of getting photos into Flickr. Your TV, your connected TV, becomes a really good way of showing your photos to a whole bunch of people in high resolution and beautiful colors. Your phone becomes a really good way of carrying Flickr around with you. These services, the relationship that we start to have with these services, and the way that and the objects that enable us to access these services fundamentally changes. Let me give you another example. Right now, you can get Netflix on virtually any terminal device that has a network connection. And moreover, because it is so tightly coupled to the service, you can now pause a Netflix instance that's running on your phone and unpause it on a TV, as long as you're logged in. You're not thinking of this. You're thinking of this as there's one Netflix out there, and it has these various avatars that manifest it as I need them. Your relationship to that service and the devices that provide it becomes very different. Because what happens is that any device that you use or that someone uses to watch Netflix becomes literally a hole in space to the Netflix service. It's a short-term manifestation of the thing that you're actually attached to and you believe in and that you're using. The value, the brand loyalty, the identification, and the focus is now on the service, not on the device that's providing the frame around it. The avatar exists to enable the service, not as an end to itself. It's a very different relationship that we are starting to have with devices themselves, with the physical product, with a physical tool. So, for example, when you have a Netflix appliance, a Netflix appliance was really just only is really only created for a single reason, to make it easier to access the Netflix service. That's what Roku does. Roku is essentially just a little augmentation for devices that aren't already Netflix enabled to make them also become Netflix terminals. Boxy Box does that for Boxy. Apple TV does it for iTunes. In fact, all of Apple's products essentially pivot around iTunes as the core service, for the most part. I mean, now it's that kind of split between the App Store and iTunes. But essentially, you often use these products not because of the inherent value the product provides, but what it gives you in terms of the service that you have subscribed to. So, changing topics a little bit to one final example that I want to talk about. So one final example is about how our relationship to everyday objects really changes once they're made with information. So once you start making things with network trackable information, those things develop what I call information shadows. Because once you can digitally identify an object, you can then get all kinds of metadata about that object. That object then grows an information shadow that you can manipulate using all of these services that are out in the cloud or even not out in the cloud. And that fundamentally changes your relationship. Now you can take your cantaloupe and see which of your friends bought that same cantaloupe. See where it was made. See how far it traveled. See how to cook it. See how to recycle the rinds. If you want to. You don't necessarily have to. But we now have the infrastructure that allows us to do this. This is a real product, by the way. This is a company called Yadamark. You don't see this very much in the consumer end of it like this. You don't see this very much in the produce store. But this is basically like an enormous number of products already tracked through the supply chain. Like you can already get the, if you wanted to, you could get the metadata about virtually any piece of food that you bought in terms of every truck it's been on, all the way back to where it was in the field of what farm it was on. So this really changes our relationship. And one of the ways that it can potentially change our relationship is that it can then change our relationship from in terms of ownership of an object. So you can change that object from being a single static thing that you bought into a service avatar. So let me explain. Continuing kind of the aviation and maybe to some extent the aluminum metaphor, but I don't know if many of you know this, but most airlines don't own their own planes, and they haven't actually owned their own planes since 1965. So they lease their planes from General Electric, sometimes complete with flight crew and ground crew. And so GE actually owns them, and GE in turn leases the engines from another division to itself. So when the airline needs more capacity, it just leases some more airplanes. It dynamically expands its capacity because it has subscribed to the service of flight from GE. It says, like, I want you to provide me flight because I have this much need for flight. GE provides it that much flight. GE, in turn, talks to GE's engine division and says, I want you to provide me the service of thrust. I need this much thrust for my airplanes because my business model of renting flight depends on this much thrust. And GE's engine division goes, sure, we'll make those engines happen for you. So when you make something with, like this with information, you make, it used to be that this kind of thing was very expensive. The reason this existed in 1965 for airplanes was that airplanes are really expensive and you can track them and you can pay people special, there aren't that many of them, and you can track them not very easily, but you can pay people money to track them, to know where they are, know who has them, know how many miles. That's all very kind of time and laborious, but it pays when you have things that are this expensive. When you buy into a car sharing service such as City Car Share or Zipcar, they have made that same service available through the use of making their devices with information at a much lower price point. So each car is connected to a central network. You can only open the car and start the engine when you use your specific key fob RFID. And when that key fob RFID matches a schedule that's up in the cloud somewhere that says okay, you match this car. This car matches this key fob in this scheduled time. So you use the GPS to track where the car is, so it knows whether it's been dropped off at the right location and how far it's driven. And all of that is transparent to you as a subscriber. You are subscribed to the service of car or ground transportation. Your relationship with these cars is actually very different than with a rental car. It's actually much more like having your own car because you have 24/7 access to it. But your relationship to the actual physical device is very different because you're not guaranteed to get the same one. You're just guaranteed to get the service of transportation, of ground transportation, when you need it. It's a fundamental shift in the notion of car ownership. Zipcar advertises this, in fact, because if you see, I don't know if you can see this ad here. This is an ad from Zipcar from I think a year and a half ago. So it says, today is a BMW day, or is it a Volvo day? So essentially what it's implicitly acknowledging is that you have bought into a car possibility space that includes both BMWs and Volvos, and you can get either one. They're, of course, advertising the fact that they have BMWs and Volvos, so they don't have Toyotas and Hyundais and Smarts or whatever. I mean, that's the point of the ad. But the other point of the ad is that it's implicitly saying there's a possibility space where either one of these could be true. It could also be a truck. It's a really different. It's a really fundamental change to what we think about when we think about what do we own. Like when you own a Zipcar or a City Car Share, and City Car Share does have kind of an ownership thing. When you own an instance, what is it that you're owning? You're owning this dotted outline of a car that can be filled in with any other kinds of cars. You're not owning a physical object, but you still own it because you can use it anytime you want. And so it's a really different relationship that we start to have with these kinds of things. So bicycles, I've already gone this. Those of you who've been to Europe, you've seen these for a while. This is the German Call-a-Bike program. It's run by the rail service because I guess the rail service decided that my enemy's enemy is my friend and my enemy is the car, so the bicycle is my friend. So they put out this bicycle program. So when you need a bike, you find one. You use your mobile phone to call it. It gives you an unlock code. You put in the unlock code. You ride the bike. When you're done, you close the unlock code and put it somewhere. And it charges your phone per minute for how long you rode the bike. So the program would not be possible without item-level identification, wireless networking, and objects that are made with information. It would not be economically possible. It would not be practical or reasonable, and it is a fundamental change in our relationship to objects. Part of this. So let me give you one final example of this, which I think is also very interesting. This is also like several years old. I hope this company hasn't gone out of business, but they actually had imitators, so I'm assuming that they didn't. This is a company called Bag, Borrow, or Steal. So it is a designer purse subscription site. So it works a lot like Netflix. You say which designer purses you want. You get your first one. When you need the next one, you send your purse in. They send you the next one that's on your list that is available. So what you're in fact subscribing to is you are subscribing to the possibility space of designer purses. And your ownership is not the ownership of a specific bag that you carry, but the ownership of a service that lets you carry the latest, most expensive bag that's out there that fits your lifestyle. And that kind of relationship wouldn't be possible if they didn't have this digital infrastructure for tracking their products, for being able to identify and track and distribute their products. So what's the trend here? Well, the trend here is that if you notice, it's getting cheaper all the time to create services out of objects. It's getting cheaper all the time to create services out of everyday things by making them out of information. It is fundamentally changing our relationship. This is fundamentally changing our relationship to what ownership means, to what design means, because these objects have to be designed completely differently when they are going to be shared in this way. For the same reason that old AT&T phones are made like tanks. They were made like tanks because people didn't own them. AT&T owned them. AT&T didn't want them to break very often. And when they wanted them to break, they wanted them to be easily fixed. So all the old AT&T phones are designed like tanks because they were based on this kind of service model. Thus, all of these different devices, all of these different products become made differently when they become a part of a service model. And information tracking allows us to do this. So what all of this adds up to, yes?
Why did, if handbags and cars and airplanes are headed in one direction, why did phones go the other way?
I think that's a complex. I think that the deregulation of AT&T as a monopoly disincentivized for them to have that centrally organized system. So then they privatized that, which in turn led to, and I think that's the core thing that happened there, and that then led to this market, which has had good positive benefits to it. I don't think we'd have cell phones that are as sophisticated as they are right now if AT&T was still left as a monopoly. However, it required, it changed our relationship to the objects. Because if we did have that, then probably, like if AT&T did own our handsets, or if the companies that we currently subscribe to, instead of selling us our handsets at this price that's amortized over the cost of your subscription, but if they actually retained that ownership, you'd probably get a different kind of handset. You'd probably get one that if you dropped it, it wouldn't crack. And you'd probably get one that was maybe upgradable, so you wouldn't have to get a new one every year because they decided to make they could upgrade the CPU because as is traditionally the case, most phones ship with about half the CPU and half the memory they actually need to run the operating system that they've been shipped with. So maybe they wouldn't do that. So I think as everything, it's a complex situation. But I think that that's my answer to the phone situation.
One other quick question. What was the name of the company you mentioned? The augmented reality company. You showed a slide of a guy reaching for a cantaloupe, and you said there's an existing company.
Sure. The company is called Yottamark. Yottamark. There's another company, one that I've actually done some work with, that does the same kind of thing for designer goods, called Certilogo or Certilogo, and they white label a marking system. So essentially, your Prada handbag will at some point, assuming that you will get a Prada handbag, at some point will have a unique embroidered URL or code in it that you will be able to use to verify that your high-end handbag is actually authentic and not counterfeit. And then once that happens, you'll then be able to essentially, should you want to do that, leverage the fact that you can find out other people in your area who have that. You can have meetups around handbags. You could get coupons based on whatever. Then the Web 2.0 thing takes off and you can do whatever you want. But the core part of it is that they are that these companies are creating these unique identification methods so that they so as to connect everyday objects to their information shadows. So that's them. So when all these things are taken together, to me this means that at a large scale, our environment is growing increasingly information-based on a fractal level. Small information devices make up medium-sized information devices, which combine to form environment-sized devices made with information as a core material. And for me, there's a really interesting opportunity here to create, in addition, an ecology of services embodied as robust, valuable, and interesting tools that tie all of these things together. So whole classes of new things can be enriching our lives and our bank accounts if we play our cards right. Thanks to the way that ubiquitous computing can interleave services and devices at an intimate, everyday level by making things with these very inexpensive information cores. And of course, this is not going to be wholly without its problems, because any new material creates both possibilities and problems. It's always a double-edged sword. We didn't get our flying cars, but nor did we have to fight atomic hydroplaning Soviet battleships. I think these are roughly from the same era in the 50s. The reality was somewhere not even in between, but somewhere else entirely, because our understanding and expectation of what was going to happen is actually very different than the reality that happens. However, I'm assuming everyone in this room is a creator of technology of some sort. For me, I think it is our responsibility as the creators of information technology to understand the properties of the material that we're using as much as we can, to explore its capabilities, and to build tools that make it easier to do the right thing with it than to do the wrong thing with it, to make it easier to make people's lives happier than to make them more miserable. And that's a big responsibility, but I believe that it is our responsibility as the people who are designing the user experiences of it, the end experiences of it, the products, much more than it is Intel's responsibility, or LG's, or any government's. In a sense, they're just mining the raw ore. We're the ones that decide what to make with it. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions. So, questions, comments? Yes.
I have a question about your sort of service and avatar
Yes.
concept. I can see that happening. Isn't it sort of almost paradoxical that a company would provide or encourage these avatars that essentially could nullify their existence? Because you were essentially advocating that any service could potentially be step in for another. You could have an avatar for an ATM. You could have, Roku or Boxy, and you could have any sort of service behind it that would just be able to use that avatar as a way to get services across.
Well, so one thing I didn't talk about here is that I think that there are two different kinds of avatars. So there are what I call appliances, which are very, very tightly coupled narrow function devices. And an example of that would be like a digital parking meter. It's very tightly coupled, to its to the service that it's connected to. It doesn't do very much other than that one thing, but it does that one thing very, very well. And then the other kinds of avatars that there are what I'm calling terminals. And terminals are essentially, right now, what we're seeing with terminals is that they're essentially digital rectangles of various form factors. They're all essentially connect to the same, if you go start from phone to tablet to laptop to some extent to connected PC to kind of projection screen, like they're essentially all the same thing. They're just various orders of magnitude. And those are terminals. And I think that those are very much increasingly growing to be a commoditized thing. Like essentially, like Apple is pretty tightly controlling theirs through like a series of various ways that they're maintaining that control. But Android isn't. And what you're seeing is a proliferation of devices that are increasingly do the same thing, and just really, the frame just becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper with each one. Yeah, that's going to make certain companies really unhappy, and but I think that the answer there is that companies then need to move from kind of this commoditized game of ever increasingly cheaper terminals to building services that are either so very tightly coupled to a specific device that it becomes an appliance, or building services that are in themselves inherently very valuable. As my former business partner Peter once said, when talking about device design, the possibility of mentioning Apple approaches one with the length of time that you talk, but let me just use them as an example. Primarily because Netflix decided not to make, like Netflix spun out Roku. If they hadn't spun out Roku, they'd be like, they would be in the position of making both the service and the appliances. Apple, iTunes is the service. Their range of products are the appliance. They're essentially making both and hedging their bets and kind of while they can. I mean, not that I think that Apple thinks in those terms, but I think that's the effect that they're having. Other companies aren't doing that, but they're increasingly kind of figuring it out. I think that's why Boxy is actually pretty interesting. Is that they first built the service, like let's figure out what's valuable. Let's figure out like how we make this service valuable, and then make it so kind of agnostic in terms of the hardware that it's running on, that you can project it onto any number of different devices. And then, when D-Link said, hey, we think this is awesome, can we make a device? They're like, sure, it's very easy. You make a little Linux box, you have it do these protocols, you're done, there's your device. You take the risk of making and selling that device. We own the service. And I think that that's, for me, an example of kind of a new model, and possibly a more, maybe a more sustainable model. And that's, right. I'm terrible at predicting things, actually. So, yes?
So when you talk about, hardware as building blocks.
Yes.
So do you see a change in hardware debugging capabilities? Because that's what seems to have happened with software, right? It becomes easy to debug, so more people create it.
I certainly hope so. I mean, the answer is yes. I think it is absolutely easier. I mean, I'm not a hardware engineer. I mean, my company makes hardware, but my business partner is the hardware engineer. And he still has to sit there with an oscilloscope, but on a regular basis, we are now able to abstract further and further away from the nitty-gritty of the actual hardware to be able to debug the system as a whole and to be able to use these building blocks. I mean, this is, to me, like, if you ever heard of a company called SparkFun Electronics, they're this big hobbyist electronics firm. So SparkFun's business model essentially is kind of abstracting these blocks of functionality to make it easier to use little chunks of functionality. They have understood that like when you have a GPS device, you don't need to know like all of the nitty-gritty of how to figure out how many satellites it's being able to triangulate on or whatever. You want to be able to know that like, okay, if I give this plus 5 volts, it's going to start spitting out XY coordinates out of this line. And they're doing that. And that is making it much easier to debug that piece of hardware. Now you know that this particular module, you give it power here, it spits coordinates and serial out here. If it's not doing that, well, then that means the module is probably bad, or you did something really simply wrong with it. So I think it's happening. I think you're also getting more software toolkits that are allowing you to like have things on screen. I mean, the D-Tools stuff that was built here is essentially a model of that, and I think that's happening. I don't quite think it's here yet, but I think that's happening back there.
So there was some point in the history of human society when major revolutions, technological revolutions might occur, like once a generation or even over longer periods of time. And now I would be surprised, by mode of things that you've discussed today, if I was not totally immersed in some new technology like next year. Do you think that trend extrapolates into the future, this shortening of that duration? And if so, how do people cope with that?
So I will paraphrase my wife, who's a researcher in this, and and her statement is that everything invented before you're 15 is the world. Everything invented after you're 15 is technology. And I think that there are going to be new things on a regular basis. I think that we are continuously trying to come to terms with the implications of technologies that are still that are already 20 years old. I don't know. I think there's going to be new stuff all the time. We live in a time where there is an enormous amount of new stuff. I think partially because of the availability of information and more building blocks, we're starting to see a whole lot of new things on a regular basis. But they saw a whole lot of new stuff made of plastic back in the 50s. And you get like a new plastic thing every year, or like a new use of plastic every year. And and that didn't freak them out to the point where the society stopped, and there was a plastic singularity. But I think we are definitely going to see a lot of changes. Certainly a lot more than human society as a whole saw in a technological sense. From say 900 to 1100. But I don't know. I think we're going to see new stuff. I think we're going to have to deal with it. I think that a huge part of, to me, what's always interesting about technology is its social implications. The actual technology, there's always going to be more of that, and people are continuously going to be making. I think that is definitely a condition of the modern world. But that's actually been true for 200 years, so at least. So I don't know if that answers your question. That kind of avoids your question, but in a clever way, maybe. I don't know.
In terms of driving down costs,
yes.
Are there new? What I want to get to is new technologies that we should be aware of in terms of robotic assembly of the kinds of devices that you make or that you're surrounded by. Are they still shops, subcontractors that are off in Asia, or often low-price providers, or are there new robotic devices that are mass-producing things and driving down costs?
I'm not sure if they're new robotic devices. I'm sure there are new robotic devices, but my company thing, I was a micro OEM. We manufacture hardware. We primarily manufacture our hardware in China. We deal with a half dozen different manufacturers there. We essentially decided that since there are 5,000 different people who will assemble our product in China, every single time we need to do a new run, we'd use a different one of them just to try them all out. The end product always looks the same, but we always have a slightly different process, and we get to see how that works. We're also seeing, and that has been made possible because pick and place machines are really cheap. They're not new, but they're cheap. What happens is that when prices go down, proliferation goes up. And so what we're seeing is that pick and place machines get cheap. People start making a little business around it. What they make becomes cheaper. And so the whole the whole system drops in price a little bit. We know our friends actually at Spark for Electronics, they used to do the same thing that we did, and they had their stuff manufactured in China. And then they went, the turnaround time, we're shipping stuff to China all the time. Why do we need that? We're smart guys. We have some capital. And they bought their own pick and place machines. And they set them up in a garage in Colorado, and they just bought their own reflow ovens and their own pick and place machines, and they figured out how to program the pick and place machines. The total capital investment was like probably $20,000. And whereas like 10 years ago it would be like $300,000 or $500,000. So the technologies are not new. It's the fact that they are at a different price point that's new. And that, I think, is really, I think what we're going to see things moving further and further down that pipeline. I mean, we're already starting to see people who are collaborating to have their own, to essentially have their own circuit designs etched onto a silicon IC and then cut apart, so you have your own piece of hardware. So you're not, so that you aren't just designing your own circuit, you're designing your own IC. And the way that that's happening is that technology has gotten cheap enough that a group of people can band together and they can have a wafer etched and cut. Whereas it used to cost, say, $100,000 to do that, now costs $10,000. 5 people can each put in $2,000 and have a wafer cut and have their own silicon etched. And so that's moving down there. Not a shift in technology, but a shift in proliferation of technology. I think that's kind of the big. I'm sure there's also shifts in technology where 10 years from now you'll be able to laser cut your own silicon wafer on a you slide a thing into a thing that looks like a microscope. It's actually a tiny CNC machine, and it just kind of goes bzz, 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 and cuts you a new IC. You solder some gold wires to it with another microscope robot, and off you go. But it's essentially the innovation is in terms of making things cheaper rather than making new things. But of course, there's also going to be new things. So who knows? Is that addressed? Okay. Other questions? I think we're almost done, right? So I think we got like one more. I think it's. I mean, I don't know when the claw comes out to get me.
Just heard Kevin Kelly at Kepler's What Technology Wants. I assume you interact with him.
Yeah, I know Kevin.
What's your reaction to the ideas in his book?
I have not read the book, so I can't say. From the title alone, I believe I am not a technological determinist. I do not believe that technology has a mind and will of its own, and that technologies shape society. I believe that they are that they create an envelope within which society acts, but that envelope is quite broad, and it is people's decisions to act within that envelope that ultimately causes kind of changes in society. But it is not a linear deterministic change. Okay, good. So, but yeah, that's. I haven't read it, but I do know and respect Kevin very much. So.
Thank Mike.
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.